The provincial land registry had her mother's farmhouse listed at $42,000. Not the land, not the barn, not the root cellar that had fed 3 generations through 4 Manitoba winters. Just the house. And when the lawyer read that number out loud in his Winnipeg office, Sylvie Tanner's ex-husband's attorney actually smiled. That smile told her everything she needed to know about the next 20 minutes of her life. Sylvie was 53 years old. She had $847 in a checking account, a 2009 Subaru, with a cracked windshield that she'd been meaning to fix since October, and a box on the chair beside her that held everything from the house on Inkster Boulevard that Dennis had decided was his, a mixing bowl her mother had brought from Quebec, a framed photograph of her daughter's first day of kindergarten, a bread knife with a handle worn smooth from 30 years of use, 16 years of marriage, and it fit in a box she could carry with one arm. The lawyer, a young man named Sutherland, with the kind of haircut that costs money, ran a finger down the asset list the way you'd skim a takeout menu. The house on Inkster, the RRSPs, the savings, the good car, all of it staying with Mr. Tanner under the terms. He tapped the bottom of the page almost as an afterthought. This last item transfers to you. Real property, Carberry area, a farmhouse looks like. He glanced up. The municipality has it assessed at $42,000. There's deferred property tax owing. You'll want to address that. What's it worth? Sylvie asked. Sutherland clicked his pen honestly. Mr. Tanner's position was that contesting it wasn't worth the legal fees. That was the most honest thing anyone said to her all morning. The farm was hers because Dennis couldn't think of a reason to want it. She signed where the tabs told her. She picked up the box. She walked out into a gray Winnipeg November and sat in the Subaru for a long while, with her hands on the wheel. The engine running, because the heater took 10 minutes to get going, and she was already cold in the way that had nothing to do with weather. Her mother had left her the farm 14 months ago. Sylvie had come for the funeral, stayed 2 nights at a cousin's place in Brandon, locked the farmhouse door, and driven back to Winnipeg, telling herself she'd deal with it in the spring. Dennis had said the place wasn't worth the drive. She hadn't argued. She hadn't argued about much those last years. That had been the arrangement, though nobody ever wrote it down. The box sat on the passenger seat. The photograph of her daughter looked up at her from the top. Sylvie pointed the Subaru west on the Trans-Canada and let the city fall away behind her. Before we go any further, if stories like this one are why you're here, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell. Because what Sylvie found inside that farmhouse is the kind of thing that stays with you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's begin. The drive to Carberry took 2 hours and changed its character the way Manitoba drives always do. The city giving way to the bypass to the highway to a grid road that ran arrow straight between fields of stubble and frozen earth. Last year's canola stalks standing in the wind like they were waiting for something. The sky in this part of the province is not a backdrop. It's a presence, low and gray and enormous, the kind of sky that makes a person feel both very small and very included in something larger than themselves. Sylvie cracked the window an inch. The cold air smelled like clay and dried grass, and something she had no name for. The particular smell of land that has been worked by the same family for 70 years. Her whole body recognized it before her mind did. She'd spent summers here as a girl. Her mother, Celeste, had taught her the things the farm taught: how to read the sky for snow, how to tell when the soil was ready, how to preserve what the garden gave you, so that February felt like a conversation with August rather than a punishment. Her father, gone now 20 years, had been a quiet man who showed love through maintenance, every hinge oiled, every board replaced before it rotted, every fence line walked in spring to find what the winter had taken. Dennis had found all of it charming when they were dating. A woman who could put up 40 jars of tomatoes and still make it to work on Monday. Later he found it impractical. He never asked her to stop talking about the farm, about her parents, about that particular kind of knowledge that lives in your hands before it lives in your head. He just stopped asking. And a thing you're never asked about is a thing you slowly put away, until one day you realize you've folded the best version of yourself into a box at the back of a closet and lost track of which closet. The grid road turned to gravel. The fields gave way to a shelter belt of Manitoba maple and trembling aspen, and through the bare trees she could see the roofline of the house. The Leckler farm, her mother's family name, the name Celeste had kept her whole life even after marrying Sylvie's father, sat at the end of a long lane of packed dirt, a white 2-story house with green shutters, one of them hanging at an angle. A red barn that had been repainted sometime in the 90s and was due again. A root cellar built into the side of a low hill, its wooden door gone gray. A machine shed. A kitchen garden enclosed by a fence of weathered posts that needed resetting. The assessor had called it $42,000, and the assessor had not been entirely wrong about the condition. And yet the foundation ran true, and the chimney stood square above the roof line. And when Sylvie finally climbed out of the Subaru and crossed the frozen lane, the air smelled exactly the way it had smelled the last summer she was fully herself. She'd come here to sell a place she'd been a child in. She hadn't expected the place to remember her back. The front door opened with the third key, a flat brass key worn smooth. The kind of key that belongs to old houses because they were built to last and knew it. The smell that came out to meet her was cold and still. The particular stillness of a house that's been holding its breath since September. She stepped inside and waited for her eyes to find the dim. The kitchen was as her mother had left it. A wood stove in the corner, cast iron, squat, serious, with a kettle on the back burner. Pine cabinets her grandfather had built. A table of scrubbed oak with 4 chairs, one of them mended at the rung with a length of wire wound tight and neat, the way her father would have done it. The walls held the quiet archaeology of her mother's life. A cross-stitch calendar from 1987, a hook with 4 different aprons, a row of preserving jars that had been washed and put away empty and were waiting. On the windowsill above the sink sat 3 African violets in clay pots, dry and past saving. Sylvie stood at the window and looked at them for a long time. She crossed the room and took her mother's apron from the hook, a blue one, cotton gone soft from 1,000 washings, and pressed her face into it. It still smelled like her. Flour and rosehip tea and something warm underneath. The smell that is specific to one person in the world, and that you cannot prepare yourself to encounter when they're gone. Sylvie stood there a long time with her face in her dead mother's apron and did not cry. She'd done her crying in a guest room, while Dennis slept down the hall with the door shut, and that well had run dry months ago. On the table sat her mother's reading glasses, a library book 2 weeks overdue, a seed catalog for the coming spring that Celeste had been marking with a yellow pencil, small check marks beside the things she'd intended to order. Sylvie set down the catalog and looked around the kitchen her mother had left her. The practical part of her, the part Dennis had spent 16 years encouraging, the part that did the arithmetic, began doing it now. Call a realtor in Brandon. Listed in spring when the mud season was past. Take whatever the market offered for a farmhouse an hour from the nearest city. Pay the back taxes, put the rest away, and close this chapter. That was the plan when she walked in the door. It lasted until the light failed. Stay with me here, because the next thing Sylvie did, almost without deciding to, is the moment the whole story turns. She didn't drive back to the motel in Carberry. She told herself it was the road. Nobody sensible drove a gravel grid road after dark in November. There was truth in that, but the truer thing was that she didn't want to leave the smell of the apron. So she carried in her overnight bag and the sleeping bag she'd thrown in the back of the Subaru, out of old habit, and she built a fire in the wood stove the way Celeste had taught her. Paper, then kindling split fine, then 2 pieces of dry poplar. The damper cracked just so. She sat on the hearth while the iron ticked and warmed and pushed the cold back into the corners of the room. She found a candle in the junk drawer and lit it and set it on the table, and its small flame threw a circle of yellow light over the whole kitchen, and the dark pressed against the windows the way dark does in the country. Complete and total, no glow on the horizon, no sound except the wind coming off the fields and the settling of the house around her. Sylvie made tea on the wood stove because that was what you did when you didn't know what else to do. She sat at the oak table in the kitchen her mother had cooked in for 40 years, $847, and a cracked windshield to her name, and for the first time in a very long while, no one in the world knew exactly where she was. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like setting down something she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight. She slept in her mother's bed under a quilt of hexagons, cotton in 100 shades of blue and green, sewn over the course of one winter in the early 70s. She slept hard and woke before light to the sound of a vehicle on the lane, tires on frozen gravel, slow and deliberate, and then silence. The first gray was just coming into the windows. Sylvie lay still and listened. Footsteps on the porch steps, a pause. Then the sound of something being set down carefully near the door and the footsteps retreating. She came to the stair quietly and stood at the front window. A figure in a canvas barn coat and a wool toque was crossing toward a rusted half-ton parked at the end of the lane. Older, maybe 65, moving with the careful economy of someone who'd been working with their body a long time. He stopped when he saw the chimney smoke. Sylvie opened the front door. The cold came in all at once. "I didn't know anyone was here," he said, turning. He had a face weathered to the color of good leather, and he held his toque in his hands. Beside the front steps was a cord of split birch, stacked neat against the wall, and a cloth bag holding what looked like a tin of coffee and a jar of something preserved. "Who are you?" she said. "Gervais," he said. "Gervais Hebert. I farm the quarter section east of here." He nodded at the woodpile. "I've been keeping the lane plowed when it snows. Checking the pipes haven't burst. Your mother, she used to leave a key with me." He looked at the smoke rising from the chimney with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Nobody told me anybody was coming," he said. "Why were you bringing wood to an empty house?" He was quiet for a moment, his eyes moving to the fields and back. "Because it's not supposed to go to ruin," he said finally. "Celeste asked me to look after it. Nobody told me to stop." His name was Gervais Hebert, and it took him 4 days and a great deal of silence to give her even that much more. That first morning he wouldn't come inside. He stood on the porch with his toque in his hands and answered her questions in short, careful sentences, his eyes moving the way a man's eyes move when he's learned to keep the exits in view. So she made coffee and carried 2 mugs out to the cold porch, and they sat on the top step looking at the shelter belt, not talking, which turned out to be the only way Gervais Hebert knew how to be near a stranger. "You knew my mother?" she said finally. "She let me put cattle on the back 30 acres every summer after your father passed," he said. "Charged me nothing. Said the land needed to be used." He turned the mug in his hands. "After she got sick, I drove her to her appointments in Brandon. She never asked me to. I just showed up." Sylvie looked at the profile of this man she'd never met, who had been driving her mother to chemotherapy in a rusted half-ton for 2 years while Sylvie was in Winnipeg telling herself she'd visit in the spring. "Why?" she said. Gervais looked at the fields. "Because she did the same for my wife years ago. Before you could understand that kind of thing, it doesn't make sense. But once you do, you can't stop seeing it." Sylvie filed that away without answering, the way you file something that's too large to open right away. The days took on a shape. She woke before light and came down to build the fire from the banked coals, blowing on them until they caught. And she made tea and carried it out to the porch to watch the light come up across the fields. That particular prairie light that doesn't arrive so much as accumulate, gray becoming rose, becoming gold. The sky enormous and indifferent and somehow kind. She started working with her hands because that was what the place asked of her. The shutter that had been hanging wrong came down, got reglazed and rehung. The fence post in the kitchen garden that had heaved with frost got reset in the ground. She cleaned the stovepipe of 2 years of creosote, lying on her back on the kitchen floor with soot raining down onto her face, and she didn't care. Dennis had spent years making her feel like a woman who needed to consult someone before she did anything. Up here, there was no one to consult. There was only the next task and the slow astonishment of discovering that she was, in fact, entirely capable of the next task. Gervais appeared at the edge of the lane each morning and vanished by afternoon. He was better with the old equipment than she was. The tractor needed a belt replaced, and he had one in the machine shed within an hour. And he knew the farm's secrets, the way you know a place you've worked beside for years. "That board in the mudroom sings," he said, the first time she stepped on it. "Your mother used to say it was the house saying good morning." They regraded the root cellar door over 2 cold afternoons, Sylvie holding the frame while Gervais reset the hinges. And somewhere in the second afternoon, without her asking, started to talk, not about himself, about Celeste. "She used to key the CB radio on Sunday mornings," he said, working a hinge pin loose. "Read out the road conditions for the whole grid, even in summer when nobody needed it. I asked her why." He paused. "She said somebody out there might be listening and need to hear a voice." "What else?" Sylvie said. "She knew every family on 5 grid roads," he said. "Not just the names, the situations. Who was having a hard year with the crop price, who had a kid in trouble who was too proud to ask." He fitted the pin back in and tested the door. She didn't gossip about it. She just knew. And she'd show up with a roast or a tank of diesel, or an afternoon's help with the combining, and she'd never say why she came. He smoothed a bead of caulk along the doorframe with his thumb. "My wife was sick for 3 years before she passed," he said. "Your mother brought supper to my house every Thursday for 2 years and 8 months. Never once was it the same thing twice. And she never once let me say thank you in a way that meant she'd done something unusual. He was quiet a moment. I didn't know you were allowed to help somebody like that, like it was just what people did. Sylvie handed him the next length of weather stripping and did not say anything, and that was the kindness, and he seemed to understand it. If you've made it this far, stay with me. Because this is where the story stops being about a farmhouse and becomes about what was hidden inside it. It was on the 8th day, moving a pine dresser in the spare bedroom to check the floorboards beneath it for rot, that she found it. She'd levered the dresser out from the wall and swept the floor beneath, and the broom caught on something. Not a gap. A seam, clean and deliberate, running square along the edge of one board where it met the next. Too straight to be age, too careful to be accident. Sylvie knelt and ran her fingers along it the way she'd been running her fingers along the farm's other small mysteries all week. The board wasn't nailed down. She worked the blade of her pocket knife into the seam and pried, and the board came up with a dry scrape, and beneath it was a cavity in the floor joists, dry and clean, smelling of cedar and cold and old paper. Inside were two things: a tin box, the kind that once held butter cookies, its lid sealed with a strip of electrical tape, and a ledger, a proper one, cloth-bound, burgundy, the kind you'd buy at a stationery shop, fat with use, its spine gone soft. Sylvie lifted the ledger out with both hands. The cover was worn smooth, where it had been opened 10,000 times, and when she turned back the first page, the handwriting inside was her mother's. Small, looped, slanting slightly to the right the way Celeste writing always had. Dated January 14, 1986. She read the first entry by the gray window light, and then she sat down on the bedroom floor because her legs no longer wanted to hold her. January 14, 1986. Knocked on the door just before midnight. A woman named Diane from the reserve south of town. 2 small children, no coats. Husband's truck in the ditch, and she'd walked 4 kilometers in the cold. Gave them the spare room and the children's clothes I had saved from when Sylvie was small. In the morning, called Lucy at the shelter in Brandon and drove them myself. Left Diane with gas money and the name of a good lawyer in the city. She was embarrassed to take it. I told her my mother did the same for a woman she didn't know in 1953, and that this was how it moved forward. Sylvie turned the page. The next entry was 3 weeks later. A teenage boy from Nipawa, 17, who'd walked away from a group home and followed the highway until he saw a kitchen light, fed him, and put him in the spare room, called the one social worker she trusted to handle it carefully, drove him herself in the morning. Then a family whose farmhouse had burned in February, stayed 3 weeks in the spare room while the insurance sorted itself out. Page after page after page, names, dates, reasons. Some long, some just a line or two. And at the end of nearly every entry, a version of the same thing. The light was on. The door wasn't locked. Told them they could come back. Before we go any further, subscribe to Epic Stories if you haven't, because the reason Celeste Leclerc kept that light burning is about to explain everything, and it changes the whole meaning of this farm. Sylvie read them aloud after a while, to the empty room, because it felt wrong to let words that quiet go unspoken into the air a second time. Gervais came in from the yard at some point and stood in the doorway and listened without taking off his coat. When she got to one entry that had no name, only a set of initials and the words, didn't want to talk. Sat with her by the stove for 2 hours, she left before light. I hope she made it home. I lit the lamp again in the window after she left, in case she needed to see it from the road. Gervais turned and went back out onto the porch. Sylvie let him go. She understood. She understood now what the house had been trying to tell her all week. The extra set of towels in the linen closet, always washed and folded, never used. The single bed in the spare room made up with hospital corners, even when no guest was expected. The hook by the back door at exactly the right height for a child's coat. The kitchen window that her mother had always left the light on in, even when she went to bed. For at least 30 years, Celeste Leclerc had kept a light burning on a Manitoba grid road so that anyone walking the worst stretch of their life would have somewhere to walk toward. She had fed them and warmed them and listened to the things they couldn't say anywhere else. She had written each one down not as a charity case, not as a story to tell, but as a person, with a name, a reason, a next step. And she had never said a word about it, not to the church, not to the neighbors, not to her own daughter, who had spent her childhood 10 feet above a floorboard she never to was loose. Sylvie opened the tin box. Inside, $340 in small bills, folded and held with an elastic band. A card from a social worker in Brandon worn at the corners. And beneath those things a bundle of envelopes held together with a piece of butcher's twine. She counted them, 47 letters. She counted them twice because the number felt like it mattered. 47 letters in 47 different handwritings, on 47 different kinds of paper, lined notebook paper, church bulletin backs, a piece of brown paper bag folded into thirds, all of them addressed in one way or another to the woman at the Leclerc farm. A woman named Diane who wrote that she'd taken the lawyer's name and used it, and that her children were grown now and had never known a night like that one, and that she told them every year at Christmas what a kitchen light had meant on a January night when she was 26 years old with nowhere to go. A man who wrote that the 3 weeks his family had spent in the spare room in February of 1998 were the 3 weeks that held his marriage together, and that he'd paid it forward in 14 different ways since, and was still counting. A teenage boy, the handwriting still young and careful, who wrote only, "I made it. Thank you for not calling anyone I didn't want called." Letter after letter. A quiet record of 40 years of grid road kindness, and the 47 times it had mattered enough for someone to write it down. Gervais came back inside when the light was failing. Sylvie had lit the candle and set it on the windowsill where it belonged, and the two of them sat at the oak table with the ledger open between them. "She wrote you down too, didn't she?" Sylvie said. It wasn't really a question. Gervais looked at the page she turned to. He read it in silence for a long moment. March 2009. Gervais H. came by to return the casserole dish. Stayed for coffee. His wife had a bad week. He doesn't say much, but you can see it in how carefully he holds himself, like a man keeping a load balanced. Sent him home with the rest of the apple cake. Sometimes what a person needs is just to sit at a table where nobody expects anything of them. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "She never told me she wrote it down," he said. "She never told anyone anything," Sylvie said. "No," he said. "That was the whole of her." He looked at the candle in the window. "That's how you knew it was real." And then near the end of the second ledger, Sylvie found her own name. The entry was dated 4 years before her mother died. "Sylvie called tonight. Sounded tired in the way that's been going on too long. There's something in her voice she's learned to keep under the surface. Her father had it too, that quality of not wanting to be a trouble. I didn't push. I know better than to push her. She'll go quiet and set like clay if you do. I wish she'd come out to the farm. I wish she'd sit at this table and just be somewhere her name meant something before it meant wife. I don't know if she will. She's been away from herself for a long time, and I think she's stopped noticing. The light's on for everybody that drives down this road. I keep it on for mine too. Just in case. It's not locked, Sylvie. It never was." Sylvie closed the ledger and held it flat against her chest, the way you'd hold something fragile. And the well she had thought was dry turned out to have been only waiting. She cried there on the bedroom floor in the candlelight, not for the marriage she'd lost, not for the years she'd been managed into smallness, but for the woman who had kept a door unlocked for 30 years and died before her own daughter walked through it. She wasn't going to sell this place. She'd known it for days. Now she knew why. She came down to Carberry 2 days later for supplies, and that was how the town found out that Celeste Leclerc's daughter had come home to the farm. It's a small town, a main street with a hardware, a cafe, a credit union, and a co-op that doubles as the post office. Sylvie had bought penny candy there as a girl. The woman behind the counter at the cafe, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, quick, looked at her across the laminate for a long moment. "You're Celeste's," she said. It carried the length of the room. "You've got her eyes." The cafe turned, and what happened next was something Sylvie had no room for, because in 16 years with Dennis, she had learned to be a woman people were polite to. And these people were not polite. They were something older and more serious than polite. They came to the booth 1 and 2 at a time. A man in his 60s, Rasian-style weathered face and good boots, took her hand in both of his. "My family lost the crop the year of the drought in '88, he said. "Your mother brought groceries to our door every week for 2 months and told my wife she'd gotten a deal at the co-op. My wife believed her for 15 years. He held her hand a beat longer. I knew. I never said. I've done the same for 2 other families since, and I always use the same story about the co-op." "She never told me," Sylvie said. "She never told anyone," he said. That was the whole point. A woman in nursing scrubs sat down across from her and didn't say much at all, because some things don't have words. A retired schoolteacher named Yvette told her she'd sent 3 students to the Leclerc farm over the years when she'd had no other answer. Kids in hard situations, whose parents needed a night to sort things out without an audience, and that Celeste had never once asked her to explain, and never once breathed a word about it to anyone in town. The constable, a quiet woman named Paquette who came in for coffee every afternoon at 3, leaned on the end of the booth with her hat in her hand. "Your mother used to call the detachment about once a year," Paquette said. "Same kind of call every time. I've got someone at my place who needs a quiet way out of a situation, and I'd like it handled gently. She'd give me a name and a direction, and that was all." She turned her hat in her hands. "I drove that grid road in every kind of weather Manitoba can produce. I never once needed more information than she gave me, because the way she gave it told me everything. It went on like that for the better part of an hour, an entire small town quietly returning 30 years of what one woman had spent on it. The man who ran the hardware refused her money for the window glazing compound and a new set of hinge pins. Your mother came in here in the winter of 2003 with a family she introduced as friends from out of town," he said. "She bought them everything they needed to set up a place of their own. Coats, boots, kitchenware, spent $600 in paid cash and didn't ask for a receipt." He shook his head. "I asked her later who they were. She said, people who needed a start." He looked at Sylvie over the counter. "You take the glazing compound. Let an old man feel like he's part of the ledger." By the time Sylvie drove back up the lane with 2 weeks of supplies and a box of storm windows someone had pressed on her outside the co-op, she understood that she hadn't inherited a farmhouse and 37 acres. She'd inherited a lamp and a list of everyone it had ever been lit for, and a purpose. Subscribe to epic stories, because the next thing to come down that grid road wasn't someone in need of help. It was someone who wanted to take the farm. And what happened to him is the part of this story Sylvie's mother had quietly arranged 19 years before she died. The black pickup came down the lane 11 days later. Sylvie heard it from the root cellar, where she was inventorying the shelves. Her mother's preserves still there, labeled in the same looped hand. She came up into the gray afternoon and watched a large, new, expensive truck park, square in front of the house the way a man parks when he's already decided the conversation is over. The door opened and a man got out who did not belong on a Manitoba grid road and didn't care. 50 maybe, trim in a down vest and good boots that had never seen mud. He had the unhurried ease of a man who decided how things were going to go before he got out of the vehicle. "Branna," he said, "Meridian Land and Holdings, you'd be the daughter." "Sylvie Tanner," she said, and did not take the hand. "This is my property. What can I do for you?" He let the hand fall without any sign it bothered him, and turned a slow circle to take in the farmhouse, the barn, the back 30 acres lying flat and dark under the November sky. "I made your mother a fair offer on this parcel twice over the last decade," he said. "Generous, given the assessed value. She declined both times without giving me a reason I could follow." He smiled, smaller. "I was sorry to hear she passed. I'm here because it would be a shame for her position to cost you what it cost her." Sylvie said nothing. She'd been learning from this farm that silence is a tool, and that most men cannot stand to leave it on the table. Branna couldn't. "Let me be direct," he said. "This quarter section sits at the junction of 2 grid roads that the RM is planning to upgrade in the next 3 years. The farmstead has a yard site, a water license, and road access on 2 sides. For the right buyer, that's not a $42,000 property. I'm prepared to offer you $120,000 for the farmstead and the yard site. You keep the 30 acres of cropland, lease it to Hebert if you like. 120, clean, and you can start over anywhere." He watched her face the way a man watches a card table. "I'm told you're between things at the moment, between things." That was Dennis's phrase, the gentle little blade of it, the way he'd always made her circumstances sound like a weather system she was temporarily experiencing, which meant Dennis had talked to this man, or to someone who had. Sylvie felt the old reflex rise, 16 years of it. The habit of softening, of making the moment end by giving way. And then she felt the ledger on the kitchen table behind her, and the 47 letters in the tin and her mother's handwriting. "It's not locked, Sylvie. It never was." The reflex died. "The farm isn't for sale," she said. "It wasn't for sale when she was alive, and it isn't now." Branna studied her for a moment with a new flatness in his expression, the look of a man recalculating. "That's unfortunate," he said. The warmth gone from his voice like heat from a cooling stove. "Because here's the reality your mother was insulated from and you aren't. That machine shed has no occupancy permit. The well hasn't been inspected in 12 years, and there's a provincial requirement for properties with water licenses. And my surveyor tells me the yard site boundary may overlap a registered drainage easement. He set a card on the porch rail. My legal team can turn this into a 2-year problem you cannot afford to manage. Or you take $120,000 and a clean walk. He got back in the black truck. Properties like this are always more trouble than sentiment is worth, he said through the window, and backed down the lane without hurrying. Sylvie stood on the porch a long time after the sound of him faded. Gervais appeared beside her, quiet as weather. That's the Meridian man, he said. He sent someone with a clipboard around the property line twice while your mother was sick. He looked at her sidelong. She ran them off both times. I don't have a lawyer, Sylvie said. I don't have $120,000 worth of trouble I can absorb. And I don't know what my mother knew about this that I don't. She picked the card up off the railing and looked at it. I don't know, she said again, and that was the truth, and it was enough to be honest about it. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in her mother's bed and listened to the wind off the fields and thought about the names in the ledger. The ones who'd had less than she had, facing worse, and who'd found their way through because a kitchen light had been on at the end of a grid road. And before she climbed the stairs, she lit the candle and set it in the window where it belonged. She didn't know yet what she was doing. She only knew it was right. The answer came up the lane the next afternoon, in the form of someone Celeste had once helped. Sylvie was at the kitchen table going through the ledger a second time when she heard a vehicle. A small blue car, older, an engine with a knock in it, coming slowly down the lane and parking at a respectful distance. A woman got out, late 60s, straight-backed, in a good wool coat, a leather satchel worn soft from years of use. She stood beside the car and looked at the farmhouse for a long moment, the way you look at a place you've heard about and are finally seeing. Then she came to the porch steps and stopped. You'd be Sylvie, she said. I'm Lucille Dufresne. I practiced family law in Brandon for 30 years before I retired. She looked up at the chimney smoke, and something moved in her face. I came because a constable named Paquette called and told me Celeste Leclerc's daughter was out at the farm alone, and because a man from a land company has been asking questions at the RM office about the drainage easement and the water license, and those two things together got me off my couch. May I sit down? Sylvie made tea, and they sat at the oak table, and Lucille set her satchel down and said quietly, running her hand along the grain of the wood, I sat at this table once before, 31 years ago. I was 27, and I had left a situation that I hadn't told anyone about, and I drove out here in the dark because a nurse at the hospital had written an address on a piece of paper and pressed it into my hand. She folded her hands on the table. Your mother gave me the spare room for 4 nights. She drove me to my sister's in Portage when I was ready. She never asked me a single thing I didn't want to answer. Lucille looked up. I've been a lawyer for 30 years since. I've done pro bono work. I've sat on the shelter board. Every bit of it is the receipt your mother never asked me to sign. She looked at Sylvie directly. So when I tell you I'm going to deal with the man from Meridian Holdings, I'd like you to understand that I have been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of chance. You'd be doing me a favor. Sylvie showed her everything. The ledger, the tin, the 47 letters. She lifted the loose floorboard and brought it all up into the kitchen light. Lucille went very quiet looking at it. She read 2 of the letters and had to stop. Then she got businesslike, because that was how she held herself together. She went through Branna's threats one by one and took the air out of each. The machine shed, she said. A man cannot use a building permit to compel a sale. The RM hasn't cited you. He's hoping the word permit makes you anxious. We pull the property records, confirm what permits exist, and address any gaps in writing before the month is out. A 40-year-old farmstead maintained in good faith is not a code violation. She tapped the table. The drainage easement is registered or it isn't. That's a 2-hour search at the RM office, not a 2-year legal problem. He's counting on you not knowing the difference between a bluff and a claim. She looked up. But there's something I want to ask you. Did your mother ever do anything with the development rights to this property? Sign anything, talk about a land trust, mention a conservation agreement. Think carefully. Sylvie started to say no, and then she stopped, because there was something in the tin box she'd set aside without understanding. Not a letter, a folded piece of paper, heavier than the rest, with a different texture. She'd assumed it was a receipt of some kind. She unfolded it now and set it on the table. It was a certificate of registration. The language was formal and dense, but 3 things stood out clearly. The legal description of the property, the date, 17 years ago, 2 years after Sylvie's father had died, and the name of the registering organization, the Manitoba Farmland and Heritage Trust. Lucille set down her mug very carefully. "Read me the clause at the bottom," she said. Sylvie read, "This covenant runs with the land in perpetuity and binds all successors in title. The property may not be subdivided, converted to commercial use, or developed for any purpose inconsistent with agricultural and residential use as defined herein, without the written consent of the Manitoba Farmland and Heritage Trust, which consent may be withheld at the trust's absolute discretion." Lucille folded her hands. "Your mother," she said, "signed a conservation covenant on this property 17 years ago. She gave away the development rights, permanently, to a registered land trust. Brannaugh's company cannot build on this land, cannot subdivide the yard site, cannot do anything on this property that isn't farming or living in that house, no matter who owns it." She looked at Sylvie over her glasses. "The RM road upgrade that makes this land attractive to him? It doubles the value of a property he can never develop. He's known about this covenant since his first title search." Sylvie stared at the page. "Then why did he come here at all?" Lucille's expression was not warm. "Because he was betting you didn't know what you had. That you were grieving and broke and would take his number to make the problem go away. And then once it was his, even land he can't develop outright has value in the right portfolio. He'd go to the trust, make them an offer, a bigger parcel somewhere, a donation, a quid pro quo. Small trusts run on thin margins. It happens." She tapped the certificate. "He needed the heir to be ignorant, and he needed the trust to be viable." "Was he wrong?" Sylvie asked. "On both counts," Lucille said. "Because you know exactly what you have now, and I happen to know who has been running the Manitoba Farmland and Heritage Trust for the last 8 years. She turned the certificate over. There was a handwritten note on the back, in Celeste's looped hand. "For Sylvie, when she comes home. She'll understand." Lucille took out her phone and made a call. The woman who came out of the trust's office in Brandon to meet them, the following morning, was the woman in the nursing scrubs from the cafe, the one who hadn't been able to find words. She put both hands over her mouth when she saw the certificate. "I knew she'd registered the covenant," she said. "I didn't know she'd left a note." She sat down. "Meridian's people called us in the spring. Twice. Offered the trust a parcel near Riding Mountain to release the covenant on the Leclerc farm. Better agricultural value, they said. More public benefit." She shook her head. "I let them finish the whole pitch both times. Then I told them the same thing, that the woman who registered this covenant drove me and my 2 children to Brandon on a January night when I had nowhere else to go and never told a soul, and that there is no parcel of land anywhere in this province that compensates for what this farm has been." She looked at Sylvie. They didn't understand that. People like Branagh never do. They think everything has a number because everything they own they bought. There was one more thing. Tucked behind the certificate in the tin was a small envelope Sylvie hadn't noticed before. Her name on the front in her mother's hand. The flap sealed, not glued, pressed shut, as if Celeste had held it for a moment before deciding. Sylvie didn't open it there. She opened it that night, alone, at the kitchen table, by the light of the candle she'd set in the window. What was in it she kept to herself, but afterward she folded it back along its original creases and tucked it inside the front cover of the ledger, where she could find it. The way, she'd learned, people keep the one piece of evidence that they were worth the trouble. Branagh came back down the lane 9 days later, and this time he didn't get out of the truck. Lucille Dufresne was the one who walked out to meet him, in her good wool coat, with a manila envelope in her hand. Sylvie watched from the porch while the old lawyer walked unhurried across the frozen lane and passed the envelope through the truck window and said something brief. Sylvie couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. She watched Branagh pull the covenant registration halfway out of the envelope and push it back. She watched him say something sharp, and watched Lucille answer with the patience of a woman who had been waiting 31 years and had nowhere else to be. The window went up. The black truck backed down the lane, careful on the frozen ruts, and did not come back. He'd come for a farmstead with road access and a water license, and he'd found a locked door. The same locked door, in a way that Celeste Leclerc had been leaving unlocked for everyone but men like him for 30 years. "There is a kind of justice," Lucille said, climbing the porch steps. "That doesn't require a courtroom. Your mother built it 17 years ago and never mentioned it to a living soul." She looked out at the fields. She didn't do it to beat anyone. She did it so this would stay a place a person could come to, long after she was gone. She handed Sylvie the envelope. It's yours now. The land and the reason for it. What you do next is up to you. If you've come all this way with Sylvie, subscribe to Epic Stories. Because what she did next is the whole point of everything that came before. The town found out the way towns find out everything. Slowly and then all at once. Lucille Dufresne, who turned out to be congenitally unable to keep good news quiet, mentioned the ledgers to one person at the credit union who told another, and by March the story of the kitchen light at the LeClaire farm had traveled the length of the RM and several past it. People started coming down the lane, not in trouble this time, but to leave things. A neighbor arrived with 2 cords of split poplar, stacked against the barn without knocking. The man from the cafe left an envelope in the tin with a note. For the next one, paid forward 15. Paquette came out on her day off and helped Sylvie reset the fence posts in the kitchen garden, and stayed for supper, and told a story about Celeste that made both of them laugh until the kitchen rang with it. Which was a sound, Sylvie thought, those walls hadn't heard enough of. You're good at this, Gervais told her one afternoon, watching her explain to a young woman from the RM office, who'd come to ask about the water license and stayed 2 hours, how the root cellar worked, what you could keep through a Manitoba winter, how the old ways weren't lost if someone took the time. At what? Sylvie said, knowing what people need without asking them to say it. She looked at him. My mother taught me that. I know, he said. That's what I mean. Sylvie stayed. She'd come out in November with $847 and a plan to sell, and somewhere between the floorboard and the trust's office in Brandon she'd stopped looking for the exit. She took on some bookkeeping work she could do remotely, enough to keep the propane filled and the lights on. She learned the farm's seasonal rhythms the way you learn a second language, slowly, then fluently. She started a kitchen garden in the spring, bigger than her mother's had been, and she put up 80 effer jars that first summer, and she kept track of who she gave them to and why, in a notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She didn't tell anyone she'd started it. She just bought a new ledger at the hardware in Carberry, the closest she could find to her mother's, and tucked Celeste's letter inside the front cover and waited. She didn't wait long. It was a night in late October, rain coming sideways off the fields, when headlights she didn't recognize turned down the lane and stopped in the yard. A woman in her 30s got out, thin jacket soaked through, a child in a car seat in the back she was working to unbuckle. She looked at the farmhouse, at the chimney smoke, at the candle burning in the kitchen window. Then she looked at Sylvie in the doorway. She had the expression Sylvie had seen in 47 letters, and once for 16 years in her own mirror. I'm sorry, the woman said. I saw the light. I thought maybe someone was home. I can go. You can't go, Sylvie said. It's raining too hard and that little one's asleep. She held the door open. The woman didn't move. Why, she said. The same question, the one that had been asked at this door for 30 years in one form or another. Sylvie smiled. My mother used to hear that question a lot, she said. Come inside. There's a fire going and there's soup on the stove. The spare room's made up. She fed them and warmed them and did not ask a single question the woman didn't want to answer. In the morning, after the rain had moved east and the woman had gone on, with a full tank of gas and $40 folded into her jacket pocket, Sylvie sat at the oak table and opened the new ledger. She wrote the date. She wrote a name. She wrote what had happened, simply, and what had come next. And at the end of it, the only line that mattered, the light was on. The door wasn't locked. She can come back. Gervais read it over her shoulder later that morning, which he'd never have done 3 months ago, and was quiet for a while. She'd have liked that you kept it the same, he said. She'd have liked that I came home, Sylvie said. He went still in the way he did, and then he nodded once and went out to check the stock tank before it froze, which was what needed doing. And Sylvie watched him through the kitchen window. An older man moving carefully across the frozen yard of a farm that could never be sold, under a prairie sky that had no patience for small thinking. She understood now what her mother had actually left her. Most of us spend our lives measuring the wrong things: the house on the good street, the retirement account, the car that starts in February. We let the people who measure that way tell us what we're worth, too. But Celeste Leclaire had fed strangers in the dark for 30 years and written each one down not as a kindness she was owed for, but as a life she'd been trusted with. She had never asked to be thanked. She had never told a soul, and in the end the quiet thing she'd given freely was the one thing on that whole farm that no amount of money could touch. Because she'd made it matter to too many people for money to reach it. Branna had $120,000, and a folder of projections, and he lost to a woman who'd been dead for 14 months, because he never understood that the most valuable thing a person can own is the good they've quietly done for someone who could never pay it back. That was Celeste Leclerc's real inheritance, not the farmhouse or the 30 acres or the water license. She left her daughter a candle in a window and a ledger full of names, and the simplest instruction a person can receive. Keep the light on and don't make a fuss about it. A legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who you leave it for, and whether they keep it burning. So if there's a light you've been meaning to put in a window for someone, some small thing you keep telling yourself won't make a difference because no one important is watching, light it anyway. Light it for all the nights nobody comes, because you will almost never know which night was the one that mattered, and to the person driving down the dark road toward it, it will mean more than you could ever measure. Sylvie Tanner was 53 years old. She had an aging Subaru, a part-time bookkeeping job, a good man checking the stock tank in her yard, and a farm that could never be taken. She had a tin full of 47 letters and counting, and a new ledger with 2 entries in it, a candle in the window, throwing its small light out across a quarter section of Manitoba dark. And every evening, the first thing she did when the sun dropped behind the shelter belt, before supper, before the radio, before anything else, she lit the candle and set it in the window where her mother had set it for 30 years, so that anyone turning down a Manitoba grid road on the worst night of their life would have, the way 47 people had before them, somewhere to drive toward. The lane came up to her door. The door was not locked. It never had been, and Sylvie Leclerc Tanner, who had arrived in November with a cardboard box and a plan to be gone by morning, understood at last that she was not at the end of anything. She was just getting started.